NASA is not always honest to us. I've displayed skepticism about the moon landing a few times now. I don't know for sure if the moon landing really happened or if it was all a big lie. I'm not here to prove that either way. All I want to demonstrate in this video is that people have good reason to be skeptical of NASA's claims. People deserve to be skeptical of NASA and the official story of the moon landing. There is a lot of evidence that sometimes NASA creates fake imagery. Sometimes they lie to us. I think NASA's real job is to create and maintain a specific perception about space. I think NASA is in the business of propaganda. The United States government had every reason to lie about the moon landing. It was the Cold War. The space race was really just an extension of the nuclear arms race with Russia, trying to determine which nation built the best technology. It was a major moral victory for the Americans to beat the Russians to the moon. So even if NASA's plan was to actually land on the moon for real, they still had every incentive to lie about their success and cover up evidence about how they did it. The average person will never have access to space. The average person will never get to experience space. So we have to trust that everything that we're being told is true. Everything that we're being shown is true. And we have to trust that astronauts are simply not sworn to secrecy as part of their role to shape our perception of space. I'm not saying that NASA completely fakes their space program. I don't want to say that NASA lies about their capabilities in space. But a lot of the photos and videos that NASA and other space agencies have created over the years have been manipulated or manufactured in some way. A lot of our identity in the West is derived from our understanding of space and our ability to master it with technology. Baby boomers remember where they were the day Neil Armstrong first stepped foot on the moon. That moment changed the world forever. If it were to turn out that the moon landing was faked, even if we had proof that it was not real, it would still be almost impossible to convince most baby boomers because of how deeply ingrained it is into their perspective of reality and humanity. In one of his books, Bill Clinton said that when the moon landing happened, a simple tradesman told him that he didn't believe that it was real because them fellers on the TV can make anything look real. Bill Clinton admitted after his time in the White House that perhaps that simple tradesman was ahead of his time. What do you think Bill Clinton meant by that? Of all of the conspiracy theories out there, the moon landing being faked is the easiest one to get into. Even Joe Rogan used to talk about the moon landing hoax on his podcast back in the day as a champion of the theory, until he eventually invited Neil deGrasse Tyson on his show to debunk it. But you have to remember that NASA has always been sketchy since the very beginning. NASA was literally founded by a Nazi, Wernher von Braun. Infamously, after World War II, the United States recruited 88 Nazi scientists as part of Project Paperclip, and Wernher von Braun was one of them. So there have been a team of Nazis working at NASA since day one. I'm sure that's fine. How do we know that NASA is not secretly designed to support their specific worldview? I don't want to pretend to have all the answers here. I've never been to space. I'm not trying to convince you of anything specific. I just want to demonstrate that people have legitimate reason to be skeptical about what NASA is really doing in space. So, what the hell is going on with NASA? On the 20th of December 2019, the United States Space Force was officially founded and signed into law as the newest branch of the United States military. Now, you can't just enlist in the Space Force. No, you have to already be a serving member of the United States military with good standing in order to apply or join. But what is the Space Force exactly? Why would a nation need a dedicated space service? Currently, they only have 2 astronauts in the Space Force, both of which from NASA, obviously, and they only just recently revealed their uniforms in 2021, which... In a way, the Space Force exists in response to the advanced nature of future warfare. It's kind of just a way to communicate to us that stuff's going on up there now. But the United States has been conducting military operations in space for a really long time now. The NRO, or the National Reconnaissance Office, is in reality the United States secret space agency. One of the functions for NASA is to run as a smokescreen for the NRO. NASA operations are often used as a cover-up for secret NRO missions. If the NRO needs to launch a secret spy satellite, for example, well then NASA will get carted out into the media to spin some story about a weather satellite or something. But the United States has been pushing to weaponize and militarize space for decades now. For example, infamously, the Star Wars program was being pushed in the media during the Reagan era. Ronald Reagan himself romanticized the idea of humanity coming together to fight against some outside force.
In our obsession with antagonisms of the moment, we often forget how much unites all the members of humanity. Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
There was never an outside force, obviously. All of this propaganda was spun up as a way to get people more on board with the idea of having missile launchers in orbit above their head, which is against international law, by the way. There's also the issue of how much money NASA is budgeted from the United States government. NASA costs the United States taxpayer $50 million per day. NASA does. So a lot of the media coming out of NASA exists simply to justify the horrendous amount of money that goes into the department. Wouldn't it be funny if that money was being used for something else? Anyways, a lot of money is moving under the NASA name. In reality, NASA is just the face of America's various space programs and initiatives. NASA is like the PR department for America's science division, curating a specific perception of humanity's presence and capabilities in space. NASA is almost like a propaganda department, designed to make it look like humanity is progressing scientifically and make it look like the United States is technologically superior. But we now have SpaceX for that today, with Elon Musk taking the role of master of technology theater, selling us propaganda about the future while simultaneously raking in billions of dollars of taxpayer money in grants. He is also a rocket man. And don't even get me started on Jeff Bezos and his penis rocket and his freaking cowboy hat. Speaking of which, do you guys remember Starman when SpaceX launched a Falcon Heavy rocket with a Tesla mounted to their payload pod? I did a spoof of that a few years ago. Okay, we're lighting you up in 3, 2, 1, launch! Well, the Starman launch gave us a spectacular view of the Earth from space. For those of us that watched it live, we saw that image of Earth in real time as the car floated off into space. It was a magical moment because humanity had never really seen an image like that before. And I got excited that SpaceX might actually show us some of that fun stuff that NASA was never really able to broadcast. Well, strangely enough, during a follow-up launch that was also being broadcast, they cut the live feed early before we got that beautiful, spectacular shot of the Earth from space. Apparently, because it's illegal to broadcast live footage of the Earth from space. Why in the name of all that is good and holy on this green earth would it be illegal to broadcast the world from space? What the hell are they hiding? Alexei Leonov was the first person to ever spacewalk outside of a space capsule in 1965. Later that year, the United States performed their first spacewalk as part of the Gemini missions. This footage is possibly the fakest official NASA film ever produced. There's an awkward moment where astronaut Ed White floats motionlessly out to the end of his tether, and right then, as he looks at the camera, he very clearly turns his entire helmet to salute. This is the first, last, and only time in history that an astronaut has been seen turning his helmet in space. This should be impossible. Pressurized spacesuits are not designed to have articulating helmets, and the astronaut's head is not usually fixed to the inside of the helmet to allow them to do this anyways. But even if this suit was designed to allow the helmet to turn, the air pressure against the seals in the neck would create far too much friction to allow the helmet to turn. Astronaut Ed White is basically in a glorified flight suit. He's like in pajamas. He's wearing a balloon that's ready to pop. The last thing you should be able to do in a suit like this is turn the head. When talking about another spacewalk with astronaut Michael Collins, NASA was caught faking imagery again when they re-released a photo of the astronaut that had already been previously published. Only this time, they blacked out the background and reversed the image. This is clearly the same photo again, just altered to make it look like the astronaut is in space. The original image was taken here on Earth in a studio during an equipment test. A lot of the Russian footage that was produced during the space race era was faked or altered in some way as well. A lot of the media that came out of Russia during that time was just straight up propaganda. The very first man in space was Yuri Gagarin. The very first person in space was Yuri Gagarin, a Soviet cosmonaut. Pretty much all of the footage that we were shown of Yuri preparing to take off on his historic launch was clearly filmed on an earlier day as preparation. The cockpit shots, for example, are too well lit. The controls are not even operating, he's just flipping dead switches. Alright, there are a million reasons why our international space agencies could be faking imagery in this way. I mean, maybe they are conducting those missions exactly the way that they're telling us, but for some reason it's impossible to produce reliable footage while in space, right? Maybe the radiation of open space damages film or interferes with cameras in some way. But what if that's not the reason that they lie to us? What if they're trying to hide something? What if they don't want us to know something? People have long questioned the validity of the live feed footage we get from the International Space Station's orbit. One time, George Bush Sr. was taking a tour around NASA, and near the beginning of the video, as they're walking through the ISS control center, you can see a feed on their screen that's supposed to be depicting an astronaut that is currently in space during the filming of this video, but for some reason, instead of showing him in the open hallways of the International Space Station, which astronauts usually have as their background in their videos, this footage shows a gridded blue screen like you would find in the background of a studio that uses special effects. I've seen endless footage coming from the International Space Station, and this time that Bush toured the ISS Control Center is the one and only time I've ever seen a CGI placeholder screen in the background of one of their shots. People have speculated that this is proof that NASA uses CGI and augmented reality to fake what happens on the International Space Station. Maybe the astronauts that were shown on television are simply actors, And what's actually happening on the International Space Station is something much more secretive. But people on the internet have been pointing out anomalies from International Space Station footage for like 15-20 years already. I wanted to do a video years ago highlighting my favorite examples, but most of that footage has been wiped off of YouTube. It used to be so much easier to find stuff on this. So instead, I found a clip of an American bringing these points up on the record to demonstrate what I'm talking about.
There's now clear evidence of NASA using numerous methods to grossly mislead the public about astronauts being on the International Space Station. During interior ISS scenes from NASA's own live feed, the use of wires, harnesses, green screens, and virtual reality have been detected to achieve the appearance of a weightless environment. Examples of this include astronauts fading in and out of the screen, green screen glitches, grabbing objects that aren't really there, pulling on invisible wires, getting tangled in their harnesses, and even astronauts appearing out of thin air. This begs the obvious question. If they're really up there, why are they using Hollywood techniques to fake the footage? Outside the International Space Station, during spacewalks, air bubbles have been recorded on numerous occasions. How is it possible for air bubbles to be present in the vacuum of space? I once questioned astronaut Scott Kelly about this phenomenon. His body language and answers only created more questions. In 2013, astronaut Luca Parmitano nearly drowned during a spacewalk when his helmet filled with water. This happened again just last year. Air bubbles, helmets filling with water, and drowning. Are they in space or are they underwater? Now what's really interesting is that they trained for spacewalks in an underwater pool with a complete ISS replica. Now surely they aren't filming these spacewalks in an underwater pool and then editing them to appear if they're in space. Because that sure would be something, wouldn't it?
There are countless lunar mission anomalies. I don't really want to go through them all, mostly because most of them have already been debunked. But there are still a handful of concerns that have never really been satisfyingly answered about the original Apollo missions. First of all, how the hell did their film for their Hasselblad cameras survive traveling through the Van Allen belt? Look how good these photos are. The astronauts on the Apollo missions used large Hasselblad film to take these photos, and the radiation from the Van Allen belt should have riddled this film with dots, making it useless before they could even take these photos. Hell, the Van Allen belt should have been lethal to the astronauts themselves. How the hell did the Apollo astronauts travel through the Van Allen belt without experiencing any adverse effects? I mentioned this in a previous video, and I said that NASA didn't know about the Van Allen belt yet. They had theorized about the belt, but nobody had ever interacted with the Van Allen belt until Apollo 11 passed through it twice, once on their way to the moon and again on their return trip. Yet not a single Apollo astronaut has ever mentioned a single thing about their experience passing through the Van Allen belt. Many years later, a group of astronauts traveled to about a 600-kilometer orbit above the surface of the Earth, and even though they never entered the Van Allen belt, many of the astronauts complained of disorientation. Apparently, the astronauts kept seeing flashes of light even when they had their eyes closed. Radioactive particles were whizzing through their head, and their eyes were interpreting that as light. If that had happened to a roll of film, when developed, it would be covered in white dots. So you'd imagine that if that many Apollo astronauts had traveled through the Van Allen belt that many times, that at least one of them would have complained about adverse effects. When that later crew in the space shuttle experienced flashes of light in high orbit, CNN published an article in response to that experience.
The radiation belt surrounding Earth may be more dangerous for spacewalking astronauts than previously believed. Scientists say the phenomena known as the Van Allen belts can spawn killer electrons when the Earth's magnetic field changes. These electrons that are being studied could have an important effect not only on satellites, which has happened in the past, but could also affect the astronauts by creating large doses of radiation that could influence their health. The electrons can penetrate through various materials, including spacesuits, and can pass through, in fact, the walls of the space station.
And one time it kind of sounded like NASA almost admitted that they'd never sent humans through the Van Allen belt before.
Before we can send astronauts into space on Orion, we have to test all of its systems. We are headed 3,600 miles above Earth, 15 times higher from the planet than the International Space Station. As we get further away from Earth, we'll pass through the Van Allen belts, an area of dangerous radiation. Radiation like this could harm the guidance systems, onboard computers, or other electronics on Orion. But Orion has protection. Shielding will be put to the test as the vehicle cuts through the waves of radiation. Sensors aboard will record radiation levels for scientists to study. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space.
My favorite anomalies come from video footage of the astronauts operating on the moon's surface itself, the best of which are examples of astronauts being caught on wires. There are a few shots that the camera seems to pick up a really bizarre lens flare where for some reason the light goes straight up instead of sprawling out. It's possible that that's a unique effect of that specific lens that they're using, but it's also possible that that light is revealing that those astronauts are hanging from a wire. Maybe that footage was filmed in a studio, and maybe that wire is holding up the astronaut to simulate 1/6 Earth's gravity. People have long theorized that filmmaker Stanley Kubrick helped NASA film the moon landing footage using movie magic to simulate space. A lot of these techniques he would have practiced and perfected while making 2001: A Space Odyssey. And years later, Stanley Kubrick used one of NASA's special low-light lenses to film one of his movies. So it's possible that Stanley Kubrick had a special relationship with NASA. Oh, funny story. One time, an old lady was arrested for trying to sell a moon rock that was gifted to her late husband by Neil Armstrong himself. NASA claimed that either the moon rock was fake or she had stolen it. Apparently, she had been keeping this moon rock as a memento of her husband, but she decided to sell it online one day to try to make ends meet. Well, apparently, it's illegal to sell moon rocks. Nobody knew this. Obviously, nobody knew this. The police didn't even warn her that she was doing something wrong. Nobody told her, even though there was ample opportunity. No. Instead, the police ran a sting on her. They pretended to be buyers of the rock, and when she showed up to sell it, they arrested her. America. What the hell is that all about? What qualities could a moon rock possess that make it too precious to sell? It's just a rock, right? Surely we should be allowed to examine a simple moon rock in order to determine its validity. I mean, why can't we examine a moon rock? Moon rocks are real, right? Well, another funny story, a moon rock that was gifted to Holland by the Apollo astronauts was determined to be petrified wood. You heard me, a moon rock that was given to Holland by the Apollo astronauts was examined, and the results said that it was petrified wood from right here on Earth. God, that's awkward. But moon rocks are real, trust me. There was also some really funny lunar orbiter footage of the Apollo crew that can only be found in one documentary. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon. In this footage, it appears that the Apollo crew faked the size of the Earth from their perspective, making it look much smaller than it should, by putting a cover over their window, and instead of having the camera right up against the glass, while filming it, they had the camera on the opposite side of the pod. So it's possible that the Apollo 11 crew never left low Earth orbit, though it's also possible that that documentary completely hoaxed that footage. There are a lot of hoaxers in conspiracy communities. A really important point to bring up is that NASA lost all of the telemetry data from Apollo 11, meaning they have no record of the flight. The most important rocket launch in human history, and they lost all the telemetry data? Well, that's not all. They also lost all of the original film footage from the broadcast when they accidentally re-recorded over the tapes. Oopsies. We never got to see that footage with our own eyes. Nobody did. There was no independent media coverage of the Apollo landing. Instead, NASA projected the footage of the live feed onto a screen in their own public viewing room, and the media was only allowed to record that screen with their own individual news cameras. So instead of getting crisp live footage, we got highly degraded second-generation footage of the moon landing. So if they faked the moon landing, this is just one more way that they could have covered up all of the imperfections in their studio footage. There's also an inconsistency with the way that the astronauts move around on the moon's surface from mission to mission. On Apollo 11, the first landing, the astronauts were awkwardly waddling around the surface, very slowly moving across the terrain. But in later missions, like Apollo 14, the astronauts were very confidently jumping around, weightlessly flying across the surface. It's almost as if there are two different sets of physics for each individual mission. Like the rules for the physics are different. The original crew of the first Apollo mission had their doubts about the possibility of their mission's success. The captain of the crew, Gus Grissom, even called the rocket a lemon. Gus Grissom hung a lemon from the door of the capsule and said that the rocket would never make it to the moon. Sadly, the original crew died when the capsule caught fire during a test. Astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were chosen to replace the original crew. And Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were the very first men to ever walk on the moon. The very first try. No failed attempts. No mistakes. Wow. The only Apollo mission on record to fail was Apollo 13, though that crew managed to survive and return home to Earth safely. Other than that, every other Apollo mission succeeded, with astronauts walking on the moon. It's just mathematically very implausible. Right after their return to Earth, the Apollo 11 crew looked totally disengaged and disinterested when giving a press conference about their trip to the moon. They should be excited, but instead they're just sad. This footage is depressing and confusing. What's going on here? Why are they acting so broken? People have suggested that these astronauts are suffering from guilt and shame for having to tell America lies, for pretending to be heroes. Neil Armstrong always acted very evasive when asked questions about the moon landing. He never wanted to talk about it. During one interview, when asked about a specific experience in space, Neil Armstrong allegedly jumped up out of his seat, ran out of the room, and began vomiting in the hallway. This could be a stress response, or it could suggest that the crew underwent some form of hypnosis or mind wipe after their mission. Neil Armstrong may have been trained to have an adverse reaction when asked to recall specific memories about his mission. Either way, since that first press conference, Neil Armstrong has never done one single on-camera interview. Ever. Neil Armstrong has always avoided talking to the media. In fact, the few times that he was on camera, he said some really weird and cryptic stuff.
During the space age, we have increased the knowledge of our universe 1,000-fold. Today we have with us a group of students among America's best. To you, we say we have only completed a beginning. We leave you much that is undone. There are great ideas undiscovered, breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers.
Truth's protective layers? What the hell is that supposed to mean? He said that at the White House, by the way. Buzz Aldrin, too, became a massive alcoholic after the moon landing, only later in his life getting his act together so he could go out into the media to describe his experience. One time, Buzz Aldrin even punched a documentary filmmaker for making him swear to God that he walked on the moon.
Why don't you swear on the Bible that you walked on the moon?
This is a hotel.
We'll call
Right,
the police.
We pay.
Come on in here, we'll call the police.
Solicit
You like that? Why don't you swear on the Bible that you walked on the moon? You're the one who said you walked on the moon when you didn't. Calling the kettle black, if I ever thought of it. Saying I misrepresented myself.
Away from me.
You're a coward and a liar and a thief.
So clearly Buzz Aldrin was experiencing a lot of stress about this. Something about the moon landing experience changed these men into a depressed, recluse shell of their former selves. Buzz Aldrin has also been very careful with the language that he uses, never directly saying that he landed on the moon or that he walked on the moon. In fact, on a few occasions, he's been caught using coded language that suggests that he never went to the moon. This is the same kind of coded language that I heard Bob Gimlin use when he was describing his experience seeing the Sasquatch. I know that I made a video debunking this years ago, but one time he told a little girl, "We didn't go there."
Why has nobody been to the moon in such a long time?
That's my question. I want to know, but I think I know. Because we didn't go there, and that's the way it happened.
And this wasn't even the only time Buzz did this in an interview. Perhaps Buzz Aldrin is trying to be a good Christian and avoid lying. So none of this fake footage that we've discovered of space actually proves that NASA has never been to space. I believe that they have actually been to space. But I think people have proven that NASA doesn't always show us what they're actually doing in space. Again, I'm not trying to prove that the moon landing was fake. I just want to demonstrate that people deserve to be skeptical that the official story is true. People deserve to be skeptical of the photos and the videos that we've been shown. We deserve to be skeptical of the stories that we're told. We deserve to be skeptical about what's really up there. So I ask once again, why does NASA fake it?